The air at Arlington National Cemetery hung thick with a reverence that was almost tangible, a heavy blanket of silent respect for the souls resting beneath the manicured lawns. Yet, for the Miller family, the solemnity of the place felt more like a suggestion than a rule. Their youngest, 10-year-old Leo was a whirlwind of unchecked energy, his loud, echoing laughter a stark contrast to the hushed tones of other visitors. His parents, Mark and Sarah, trailed behind him, their attempts to quiet him half-hearted and ineffective. "Leo, honey," inside voices, Sarah would murmur, her words lost as Leo darted toward the tomb of the unknown soldier, his bright red sneakers, a flash of defiance against the pristine white marble. The crowd gathered. There was a mix of somber veterans, curious tourists, and schoolchildren on a field trip, all watching the metronomic precision of the tomb guard. They were witnessing a sacred ritual, a display of discipline and honor that had unfolded uninterrupted for decades. But Leo saw only a man in a fancy uniform doing a funny walk, a perfect new target for his playful antics, completely oblivious to the invisible line he was about to cross. His parents, caught up in documenting their trip for social media, failed to notice the growing unease among the onlookers, or the subtle shift in the atmosphere, as their son's boisterousness began to grate on the sacred silence. They were tourists in a land of pilgrims, and their casual disregard was a ticking clock, counting down to a moment of reckoning they couldn't yet fathom. The guard on duty, Sergeant Miller, no relation to the disruptive family, continued his patrol with unwavering focus, his face a mask of stoic dedication. Each step was a testament to a legacy of honor, his M14 rifle held with a familiarity that spoke of countless hours of training. He was more than a soldier. He was a sentinel, a living monument to the unidentified fallen who lay in eternal vigilance. His world was one of rigid order and profound silence, a silence that was now being systematically dismantled by the shrieks and giggles of a single child. The sergeant's training had prepared him for every conceivable distraction, from sudden weather changes to medical emergencies in the crowd. But the persistent, almost deliberate disrespect from the Miller family was a different kind of intrusion. It was an erosion of the very sanctity he was sworn to protect. He could feel the eyes of the crowd shifting, their silent pleas for intervention hanging in the air. They looked to him not just as a guard, but as the enforcer of a hallowed tradition. He knew he had to act, but the protocol was strict. A verbal correction was the first step, a tool to be used with precision and authority. He continued his 21 steps, his mind calculating the exact moment to intervene, his resolve hardening with every disruptive shout from the boy, who was now mimicking his march much to his parents' amusement. Mark and Sarah exchanged a proud, albeit tired smile as they watched Leo. "He has so much spirit," Mark commented, raising his phone to capture a video of his son mocking the guard's solemn walk. To them, this was just another stop on their Washington, D.C. tour, a photo opportunity to be checked off a list. The historical weight of the location was lost on them, overshadowed by the desire to create a perfect family vacation album. They saw the stern-faced soldier not as a guardian of a sacred trust, but as part of the scenery, an interactive exhibit for their son's entertainment. The disapproving glares from other visitors were dismissed as the grumpiness of strangers. "People need to lighten up," Sarah whispered to Mark. "It's a public place after all." This fundamental misunderstanding of their environment was the root of the escalating tension. They failed to grasp that they were not in a park or a playground. They were on hallowed ground, a place where the currency was respect, and they were bankrupt. Their casual entitlement created a bubble around them, insulating them from the palpable disapproval of everyone present and blinding them to the guard's tightening jaw and the almost imperceptible change in his posture that signaled his patience was wearing thin. The situation began to escalate when Leo, emboldened by his parents' lack of restraint, broke away from them and ran directly onto the plaza, stopping only a few feet from the black mat that marked the guard's path. He struck a clumsy, exaggerated pose, mimicking the soldier's posture with his hands on his hips, and let out a loud, "Halt!" The crowd gasped collectively. This was no longer a background annoyance. It was a direct and flagrant violation. The invisible barrier of respect had been shattered. Other parents pulled their own children closer, their eyes wide with a mixture of shock and anticipation. A veteran in a wheelchair, his face etched with sorrow and anger, shook his head slowly. The tomb guard stopped his patrol mid-step, his body freezing with an unnatural stillness. The sudden cessation of his rhythmic march was more jarring than any sound. For a long, breathless moment, the only noise was the distant city traffic and the frantic beating of hearts. The sergeant's gaze, which had been fixed forward, slowly shifted, his eyes locking onto the small boy who stood defiantly on the sacred marble. The air crackled with unspoken tension. The performance was over. A lesson was about to be taught. It is requested that visitors to the tomb of the unknown soldier remain silent and respectful. This rule, posted on numerous signs and enforced by the sentinels, is the cornerstone of the site's solemnity. The Miller family had ignored every sign, every disapproving glance, and every hushed attempt by others to quiet them. Now their son stood in the heart of that sacred space, a living embodiment of their disregard. The tomb guard, a symbol of unwavering discipline, faced a direct challenge. His training dictated a clear protocol, but the sheer audacity of the act required more than a standard correction. It required a reassertion of the sanctity of the tomb itself. He took a slow, deliberate breath, the polished leather of his uniform creaking softly in the now absolute silence. His mind was clear, his purpose defined. He was not just a soldier, he was the voice of the unknowns, the silent guardians of a nation's memory, and that voice, silent for so long, was about to be heard. The crowd held its breath, sensing that the carefully maintained order of this hallowed place was about to be restored with an authority that no one, especially not the oblivious parents, could possibly anticipate. The stage was set for a confrontation that would be remembered long after the family's vacation photos faded. The silence that followed Leo's stunt was profound, a vacuum that seemed to pull all the air from the plaza. Sergeant Miller remained frozen for another heartbeat, a statue carved from duty and discipline. Then, with a precision that was both mesmerizing and terrifying, he moved. It wasn't his usual patrol. He pivoted on his heel, the sound of his metal tapped. Shoes a sharp crack against the marble, a sound that made several people flinch. He took 3 powerful, deliberate strides that brought him directly in front of the small boy. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His voice, when it came, was a low, resonant baritone that sliced through the tension with the sharpness of a bayonet. It is requested that all visitors maintain a state of silence and respect. The words were delivered not as a request, but as an incontrovertible command. Each syllable was perfectly enunciated, carrying the weight of the institution he represented. Leo, who had been grinning moments before, found his smile faltering, his bravado evaporating under the intensity of the soldier's gaze. The guard stood over him, his shadow completely engulfing the boy, a silent, imposing mountain of unwavering resolve. He was no longer part of the scenery. He was the most real, most intimidating presence Leo had ever encountered. The boy took an involuntary step back, stumbling slightly, his eyes wide with a dawning, terrifying understanding. He had poked a bear he didn't know was there. Mark and Sarah, finally jolted from their social media stupor, rushed forward. The sight of the imposing soldier addressing their son ignited a flare of parental indignation. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" Mark called out, his voice laced with an arrogant anger. "He's just a child," Sarah added, her tone sharp and accusatory as she reached for Leo's arm, pulling him behind her as if the guard were a physical threat. They positioned themselves between the soldier and their son, creating a defiant family unit against the perceived aggressor. "There's no need to scare him like that. He was just playing," Mark snapped, puffing out his chest. They completely failed to read the room, to see the sea of faces staring at them with open disapproval. In their minds, their child was faultless, and this uniformed man was a bully who had overstepped his authority. They saw his correction not as a necessary enforcement of solemn rules, but as a personal attack on their family and their parenting. The veteran in the wheelchair muttered something under his breath, a quiet condemnation lost in the parents' loud protests. The confrontation had shifted. It was no longer about a misbehaving child, but about two adults challenging the very embodiment of the honor and sacrifice the tomb represented. The sergeant did not flinch. He did not react to their accusations or their aggressive posturing. His gaze remained fixed, not on the parents, but just over their heads, as if looking toward a higher authority. His training was absolute. He was not to engage in arguments. He was to restore order. His purpose was singular, to protect the sanctity of this ground. The parents' outburst was just another distraction to be managed, another layer of disrespect to be methodically dismantled. He allowed their words to hang in the air, to be judged by the silent court of public opinion. The other tourists shifted, uncomfortably, their sympathies clearly not with the loud, indignant family. They had all seen the boy's behavior. They had all felt the breach of decorum. The parents' defensive tirade only served to highlight their own ignorance and arrogance, casting them as the villains in a drama of their own making. The sergeant's silence was his most powerful weapon. It amplified their foolishness, making their angry words seem hollow and profane in the sacred quiet of the plaza. He let them exhaust their initial burst of outrage, knowing that what came next would require no further explanation. The tension stretched to a breaking point. Mark, receiving no response from the guard, grew more agitated. "Are you even listening to me? I asked you a question. Who do you think you are?" He took a step closer, violating the guard's personal space, a move of pure, unthinking aggression. This was the final line to be crossed. The sergeant's training had specific protocols for this exact scenario, a direct challenge to his authority and a potential physical threat. The crowd collectively held its breath, anticipating the soldier's response. Would he physically restrain the man? Would he call for backup? The air was thick with a dozen unspoken possibilities, each more dramatic than the last. The guard's expression remained unchanged, a mask of impenetrable calm. But a subtle shift occurred. His weight transferred almost imperceptibly to the balls of his feet, his body coiled like a spring, ready for action. He was no longer just a sentinel performing a ritual. He was a soldier prepared to defend his post. The moment had been stripped of all ceremony. It was now a raw confrontation between order and chaos, respect and entitlement. Without breaking his gaze from the horizon, the tomb guard executed his next move with breathtaking speed and precision. He slammed the butt of his M14 rifle into the marble plaza. The sound was not a crack. It was a deafening explosion, a thunderclap that echoed across the cemetery, shocking everyone into stunned silence. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated authority, a sonic boom that vibrated through the soles of everyone's feet and deep into their bones. Birds startled from nearby trees, and in the distance, a car alarm began to shriek. Mark and Sarah froze, mid-sentence, their mouths agape, their angry tirade instantly forgotten. Leo let out a small cry and buried his face in his mother's side. The single explosive sound had done more to command attention than 1,000 words ever could. It was a declaration. It was a final warning. And it was the prelude to the order that would silence them completely. An order that would strip away their indignation and leave them standing bare and shamed before the silent tomb and the watching world. The plaza was now his. He had reclaimed it with a single powerful action. Following the thunderous impact of the rifle, a new kind of silence descended, one born not of reverence, but of pure shock. The parents, Mark and Sarah, were paralyzed, their faces a mixture of fear and disbelief. The anger had been blasted out of them, replaced by a raw, primal understanding that they had made a terrible mistake. The tomb guard, having secured the undivided attention of every person present, finally lowered his gaze. His eyes, cold and clear as polished steel, moved from the parents and settled directly on the boy, Leo, who was still trembling behind his mother. The sergeant's face remained an impassive mask, but his voice, when he spoke again, carried an even greater weight. It was not loud, yet it seemed to fill the entire space, each word a carefully chosen stone dropped into a silent pool. "This ground is sacred," he began, his tone low and deliberate, "hallowed by the sacrifices of soldiers who gave their everything, including their names." He paused, letting the gravity of his words sink in, letting the family and the crowd truly hear the meaning behind the ritual they had so casually disrupted. He was no longer just enforcing a rule, he was delivering a lesson in history, honor, and the cost of freedom. He then shifted his focus to the parents, and for the first time a flicker of something other than stoicism appeared in his eyes. It was a profound, weary disappointment. "You are his parents," the sergeant stated, the words hanging in the air like a judgment. "It is your duty to teach him respect, not just here but in the world. You teach him to honor the sacrifices that grant you the freedom to stand here today." He wasn't berating them, he was holding a mirror up to their failure, and the reflection was unflattering and undeniable. Mark and Sarah visibly deflated, the last vestiges of their defensive posture crumbling away. Shame washed over them, hot and heavy. They looked at their son, then at the tomb, then at the faces of the strangers watching them, and for the first time, they saw their own behavior. Through the eyes of others, they saw the arrogance, the entitlement, the profound disrespect. The guard's words were not an attack, but an indictment of their own character, and it struck them with more force than any physical blow could. The public plaza had become a private classroom, and the lesson was humility. The sergeant then issued his final order, the one that would cement this moment in their memories forever. His voice remained level, devoid of anger but filled with an authority that was absolute. "You will take your son's hand," he commanded, his gaze sweeping over all three of them. "You will walk to the edge of this plaza. You will turn and face the tomb. And you will stand here in silence and watch the remainder of this changing of the guard. You will watch and you will reflect on what this place means." It was not a suggestion, it was a sentence. He was not banishing them. He was compelling them to participate in the very solemnity they had desecrated. He was forcing them to confront the meaning of the place they had treated like a playground. It was a brilliant, psychologically astute command, turning their punishment into a moment of potential enlightenment. They were being ordered to show the respect they had so conspicuously lacked, to stand as silent witnesses to the honor they had failed to comprehend. Without a word, Mark reached down and took Leo's hand. Sarah took his other hand. Their movements were stiff, mechanical, as if they were puppets being controlled by the guard's will. They turned and walked, a shamed and silent trio, to the spot he had indicated at the edge of the marble. The crowd parted for them, their faces a mixture of pity and stern approval. The family came to a stop, turned, and faced the tomb, their backs now to the other visitors. They stood there, a small island of public penance. The veteran in the wheelchair gave a slow, deliberate nod of approval. The tomb guard watched them for a moment, ensuring his order was obeyed, before seamlessly resuming his duties. He executed a flawless turn, his rifle returning to its position on his shoulder, and began his 21-step patrol once more. The rhythmic click of his heels on the marble returned, stitching the torn fabric of the ceremony back together. The sacred rhythm was restored, the disruption contained and corrected. The guard's actions had been a masterclass in control, de-escalation, and the powerful assertion of moral authority. For the next 15 minutes, the Miller family stood motionless, their forced stillness a stark contrast to their earlier chaos. Leo, for the first time all day, was completely quiet, his eyes fixed on the unwavering sentinel. He watched the soldiers' perfect steps, the intricate rifle maneuvers, the sheer, unyielding focus. He was no longer seeing a man in a funny costume. He was seeing a symbol, something powerful and important, even if he couldn't fully grasp what it was. Mark and Sarah stood beside him, the minutes stretching into an eternity of silent reflection. The anger and indignation had been replaced by a deep, gnawing shame. They were forced to listen to the silence, to feel the weight of the history surrounding them. They watched as a new guard took over, the ceremony unfolding with a grace and precision that now seemed breathtakingly beautiful. They had arrived as tourists seeking entertainment. They would leave as something else entirely. The guard's order had not just silenced them, it had opened their eyes. It was a lesson etched not in a textbook, but in the hard marble of a sacred tomb and the unyielding gaze of its guardian. As the final, crisp movements of the changing of the guard ceremony concluded, a palpable sense of peace resettled over the plaza. The Miller family, however, remained frozen in place for a moment. Longer, the Silence now a choice, not a command. Slowly they turned to leave, their movements subdued and heavy. The arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a tangible shame. Mark held Leo's hand with a gentleness that wasn't there before, while Sarah wiped away the silent tears that stained her face. She was no longer crying from humiliation, but from an overwhelming understanding. During those long minutes of forced reflection, she finally saw what others saw: the reverence, the honor, and the sacrifice the place represented. The tomb had transformed from a tourist spot into a sacred altar in her mind. Instead of heading for the exit, they walked toward the veteran in the wheelchair who had witnessed everything. Mark, once brimming with indignation, now seemed small and remorseful. "Sir," he began, his voice low, we apologize for our behavior. We were wrong." The veteran looked up at them, his face softening into a tired smile. "He's just a child," the old man said, echoing the very words the parents had shouted. "But this place is for the ones who never got to grow up." The guards, he wasn't protecting the stone, he was protecting their memory. A lesson in respect is never a bad thing. The veteran's words, offering a grace they didn't deserve, were more impactful than any reprimand could have been. The Miller family walked away, the weight of the lesson etched into their souls. They left Arlington Cemetery transformed. The loud laughter was replaced by a somber quiet that would accompany them for the rest of their trip. They had arrived as tourists seeking entertainment and left as pilgrims who had been confronted with the true meaning of honor. The guard's order had not just silenced them, it had silenced the noise in their own lives, forcing them to listen to something more profound. Far from the plaza in the guard quarters, Sergeant Miller's duty shift ended. He felt no pride, only the weary weight of his responsibility. He had done his duty, order was restored, and the eternal vigil continued, a silent reminder of the rules and the respect owed to those who gave everything, even their names.